Chapter 33. Smike and Newman Noggs, who in his impatience had returned home long before the time agreed upon, sat before the fire listening anxiously to every footstep on the stairs and the slightest sound that stirred within the house for the approach of Nicholas. Time had worn on and it was growing late. He had promised to be back in an hour, and his prolonged absence began to excite considerable alarm in the minds of both, as was abundantly testified by the black looks that they cast upon each other with every new disappointment. At length the coach was heard to stop, and Newman ran out to light Nicholas up the stairs. Beholding him in the trim described at the conclusion of the last chapter, he stood aghast in wonder and consternation. "Don't be alarmed," said Nicholas, hurrying him back into the room. "There's no harm done, beyond what a basin of water can repair." "No harm!" cried Newman, passing his hands hastily over the back and arms of Nicholas, as if to assure himself that he'd broken no bones. "Whatever have you been doing?" "I know all," interrupted Nicholas. "I have heard a part and guessed the rest. But before I remove one jot of these stains, I must hear the whole story from you. You see, I am collected. My resolution is taken. Now, my good friend, speak out, for the time for any palliation or concealment is past. And nothing will avail Ralph Nickleby now." "Your dress is torn in several places. You walk lame, and I'm sure you're suffering pain," said Newman. "Let me see to your hurts first." "I have no hurts to see to, beyond a little soreness and stiffness that will soon pass off," said Nicholas, seating himself with some difficulty. "But if I have fractured every limb and still preserve my senses, you should not bandage one till you have told me what I have a right to know. Come," said Nicholas, giving his hand to Noggs. "You had a sister of your own, you told me once, who died before you fell into misfortune. Now think of her and tell me, Newman." Yes, I will," said Noggs. I'll tell you the whole truth." Newman did so. Nicholas nodded his head from time to time as it corroborated the particulars he'd already gained, but he fixed his eyes upon the fire and did not look round once. His recital ended, Newman insisted upon his young friend stripping off his coat and allowing whatever injuries he had received to be properly tended. Nicholas, after some opposition, at length consented, and with some pretty severe bruises on his arms and shoulders, which Newman rubbed with oil and vinegar and various other efficacious remedies which he borrowed from different lodgers, related in what manner they had been received. The recital made a strong impression on the warm imagination of Newman Noggs, for when Nicholas came to the violent part of the quarrel, he rubbed Nicholas back so hard as to occasion him the most exquisite pain, which he would not have exhibited, however, for the world, it being perfectly clear that for the moment Newman was operating on Sir Mulberry Hawk, and had quite lost sight of his real patient. This martyrdom over, Nicholas arranged with Newman that while he was otherwise occupied next morning, arrangements should be made for his mother's immediately quitting her present residence, that is, the house that Ralph Nickleby had supplied, and also for dispatching Miss La Creevy to Smike to break the intelligence to her. He then wrapped himself in Smike's greatcoat and repaired to the inn where they were both to pass the night, and where, after writing a few lines to Ralph, the delivery of which was to be entrusted to Newman the next day, he endeavoured to obtain the repose of which he stood in so much need. Drunken men, they say, may roll down precipices and be quite unconscious of any serious personal inconvenience when their reason returns. The remark may possibly apply to injuries received in other kinds of violent excitement. Certain it is that although Nicholas experienced some pain on that first awakening the next morning, he sprang out of bed as the clock struck 7 with very little difficulty, and was as much on the alert as if nothing had happened. Merely looking into Smike's room and telling him that Newman Noggs would call to him very shortly, Nicholas descended into the street and, calling a hackney coach, bade the man drive to Mrs. Wyterley's, according to the direction which Newman had given him on the previous night. It wanted 7:45 when they reached Cadogan Place. Nicholas began to fear that nobody might be stirring at that early hour, when he was relieved by the sight of a female servant employed in cleaning the doorsteps. By this functionary he was referred to the doubtful page, Alphonse, who appeared with dishevelled hair and a very warm and glossy face, as if he had just got out of bed. By this young gentleman he was informed that Miss Nickleby was then taking her morning walk in the gardens before the house. On the question about being propounded whether he could go and find her, the page desponded and thought not, but being stimulated with a shilling, he grew sanguine and thought he could. "Say to Miss Nickleby that her brother is here, and in great haste to see her," said Nicholas. The plaited buttons disappeared with an alacrity most unusual to them, and Nicholas paced the room in a state of feverish agitation, which made the delay even of a minute insupportable. He soon heard a light footstep which he knew so well, and before he could advance to meet her, Kate had fallen on his neck and burst into tears. "My darling girl," said Nicholas as he embraced her, "how pale you are!" "I have been so unhappy here, brother, so unhappy," sobbed poor Kate, "so very, very, very miserable. Do not leave me here, dear Nicholas, or I shall die of a broken heart." "I shall leave you nowhere," answered Nicholas. "Never again, Kate," he cried, moved in spite of himself as he folded her to his heart. "Tell me that I have acted for the best. Tell me that we parted because I feared to bring misfortune on your own head, that it was a trial to me no less than to yourself, and that if I did wrong it was in ignorance of the world and unknowingly." "Why should I tell you what we all know so well?" returned Kate soothingly. "Nicholas, dear Nicholas, how can you give way thus?" "It is such bitter reproach to me to know that you have been so badly treated," returned her brother, "to see you so much altered and yet so kind and patient." "Oh, oh God!" cried Nicholas, clenching his fist and suddenly changing his tone and manner. "It sets my whole blood on fire again. You must leave here with me directly. You shall not sleep here one more night." "But I knew all that before I came here. To whom can I speak before we drive away?" The question was most opportunely put, for at that instant Mr. Wyterley walked in, and to him Kate introduced her brother, who at once announced his purpose and the impossibility of deferring it. "The quarter's notice," said Mr. Wyterley, with the gravity of a man on the right side, "is not yet half expired. Therefore," interposed Nicholas, "the quarter's salary must be lost, sir. You will excuse this extreme haste, but circumstances require that I should immediately remove my sister, and I have not a moment's time to lose. Whatever she brought here I will send for, if you allow me, in the course of the day." Mr. Wyterley bowed, but offered no opposition to Kate's immediate departure, and which indeed he was rather gratified than otherwise. Sir Tumley Snuffim, the doctor, if you remember, having seen it as his opinion that she rather disagreed with Mrs. Whittley's constitution. "With regard to the trifle of salary that is due," said Mr. Whittley, "I will—" Here he was interrupted by a violent fit of coughing. "I will owe it to Miss Nickleby." Mr. Whittley, it should be observed, was accustomed to owe small amounts and leave them owing. All men have little pleasant ways of their own, and this was Mr. Whittley's. "If you please," said Nicholas, and once more offering a hurried apology for so sudden a departure, he hurried Kate into the vehicle and bade the man drive away with all speed into the city. To the city they accordingly went with all speed that the hackney coach could make, and as the horses happened to live at Whitechapel and be in the habit of taking their breakfast there when they breakfasted at all, they performed the journey with greater expedition than could have reasonably been expected. Nicholas sent Kate upstairs a few moments before him, that his unlooked-for appearance might not alarm his mother, and when the way had been paved, presented himself with much duty and affection. Newman had not been idle, for there was a little cart at the door with the effects which were preparing to be hurried away already. Now, Mrs. Nickleby was not the sort of person to be told anything in a hurry, or rather to comprehend anything of peculiar delicacy or importance on a short notice. Wherefore, although the good lady had been subjected to a full hour's preparation by Miss Nickleby, and was now addressed in the most lucid terms by Nicholas and his sister, she was in a state of singular bewilderment and confusion, and could by no means be made to comprehend the necessity of such hurried proceedings. "Why don't you ask your uncle, my dear Nicholas, what he can possibly mean by it?" said Mrs. Nickleby. "My dear mother," returned Nicholas, "the time for talking has gone by. There is but one step to take, and that is to cast him off with the scorn and indignation he deserves. Your own honour and good name demand that, after the discovery of his vile proceedings, you should not be beholden to him one moment, even for the shelter of these bare walls." To be sure," said Mrs. Nickleby, crying bitterly. He is a brute, a monster, and the walls are very bare and want painting too, and I have had this ceiling whitewashed at the expense of 18 pence, which is very, 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 very distressing, considering that it is so much gone into your uncle's pocket. I never could have believed it, never." As Nicholas and his sister were by this time compelled to superintend the removal of the few articles of furniture, Miss Nickleby devoted herself to the consolation of Mrs. Nickleby, and observed with great kindness that she must really make an effort and cheer up. "Oh, I dare say, Miss Nickleby," returned Mrs. Nickleby, with a petulance not unnatural in her unhappy circumstances. "It is very easy to say cheer up, but if you have had so many occasions to cheer up as I have, and there," said Mrs. Nickleby, stopping short, "think of Mr. Pike and Mr. Pluck, two of the most perfect gentlemen that ever lived. What am I to say? What am I to say? Am I to say to them, I am told your friend Sir Mulberry is a base wretch? If I do, they will laugh at me." Having seen everything safely out, discharged the servant, and locked the door, Nicholas jumped into a cabriolet and drove to a by-place near Golden Square, where he had appointed to meet Noggs. And so quickly had everything been done that it was barely 9:30 when he reached the place of meeting. "Here is the letter for Ralph," said Nicholas, "and here is the key to that wretched house in which he made my mother and sister live. When you come to me this evening, not a word of last night. Ill news travels fast, and they will know it soon enough. Have you heard if that wretch Hawke is much hurt?" Newman shook his head. I will find that out myself without loss of time," said Newman. And you'd better take some rest. You're fevered and ill." Nicholas waved his hand carelessly, and concealing the indisposition he really felt, now that the excitement which had sustained him was over, took a hurried farewell of Newman Noggs and left him. Newman was not 3 minutes' walk from Golden Square, but in the course of that 3 minutes he took the letter out of his hat and put it in again 20 times at least, first the front, then the back, then the sides, then the superscription, then the seal, were objects of Newman's admiration. Then he held it at arm's length as if to make it in the whole one delicious survey, and then he rubbed his hands in a perfect ecstasy with his commission. He reached the office, hung his hat on the accustomed peg, laid the letter and the key on the desk, and waited impatiently until Ralph Nickleby should appear. After a few minutes, the well-known cracking of his boots was heard upon the stairs, and then the bell rung. "Has the post come in?" "No." "Any other letters?" "Yes, this one." Newman eyed him closely and laid it on the desk. "What's this?" asked Ralph, taking up the key. "Left with the letter. A boy brought them, 1/4 hour ago or less." Ralph glanced at the direction, opened the letter, and read as follows. Nicholas had written, "You are known to me now. There are no reproaches I could heap upon your head which would carry with them 1,000th part of the grovelling shame that this assurance will awaken even in your breast. Your brother's widow and her orphan child spurn the shelter of your roof, and shun you with disgust and loathing. Your kindred renounce you, for they know no shame but the ties of blood which bind them in name to you. You are an old man, and I leave you to the grave. May every recollection of your life cling to your false heart and cast their darkness on your very deathbed." Ralph Nickleby read this letter twice, and frowning heavily, fell into a fit of musing. The paper fluttered from his hand and dropped upon the floor, but he clasped his fingers as if he held it still. Suddenly he started from his seat, and thrusting it into his pocket, turned furiously to Newman Noggs, as if to ask him why he lingered. But Newman stood unmoved with his back towards him, following up with worn and blackened stump of an old pen some figures in an interest table which was pasted against the wall, and apparently quite abstracted from every other object.